So if you have a Bible with you, could you turn with me to Judges chapter 10? And for those of you that were with us this time last week, there couldn't be any more of a great contrast, really, between the size of this chapter and the size of that chapter. That's 57 verses for us to all get through, and this week we've just got 18. However, if you've read Judges 10, you might be thinking, no wonder it's only 18. Well, let's have a look. What's even in here? So let's have a read around together. And after Abimelech, there arose to save Israel Tola, the son of Pua, the son of Dodo, a man of Issachar. And he dwelt in Shamir in the mounts of Ephraim. He judged Israel 23 years, and he died and was buried in Shamir. And after him rose Jair, a Gileadite. He judged Israel 22 years. Now he had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys. And they had 30 towns, which are called Havoth Jair, to this day, which are in the land of Gilead. And Jair died and was buried in Kamon. Verse 6.
Again, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight, and they served the images of Baal and Ashtaroth, and the gods of Aram, Side, Moab, Ammon, and Phistilia. They abandoned the Lord and no longer served him at all. So the Lord burned with anger against Israel, and he turned them over to the Philistines and the Amorites, who began to oppress them that year. For 18 years they oppressed all the Israelites east of the river Jordan and the land of the Amorites, that is, in Gilead. The Amorites also crossed to the west side of the Jordan and attacked Judah, Benjamin, and Ephraim. The Israelites were in great distress. Finally they cried out to the Lord for help, saying, "We have sinned against you because we have abandoned you as our God, and we have served the images of Baal." The Lord replied, "Did I not rescue you from the Egyptians, the Amorites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Sidonians, and the Amalekites, and the Moabites? When they oppressed you, you cried out to me for help, and I rescued you, yet you have abandoned me and served other gods. So I will not rescue you anymore. Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them rescue you in the hour of your distress." Verse 15.
But the Israelites said to the Lord, "We have sinned. Do with us whatever you think best, but please rescue us now." Then they got rid of the foreign gods among them and served the Lord, and he could bear Israel's misery no longer. When the Ammonites were called to arms and camped in Gilead, the Israelites assembled and camped at Mizpah. The leaders of the people of Gilead said to each other, "Whoever will take the lead in attacking the Ammonites will be head over all who live in Gilead."
There we go. So that's chapter 10. How am I supposed to do a Bible study off the back of that? I mean, I ask you really. What's even there, to even talk about? I mean, it's what we call a Ron Seal chapter. It does exactly what it says on the tin. It's kind of there and that's it, and it's no more complex or complicated than that at all. It's all kind of put together. So, as you can imagine, this is one of them kind of scriptures that if you read the commentaries, if you look at it, nobody's got really anything exciting to say about it. Maybe a few lines to talk about it, and that's kind of really it. And if you take this as a chapter in isolation, that's exactly where you are. Because what's chapter 10 really all about? But you know that these are the kind of chapters that I absolutely love. I know that the Lord has clearly hidden something for us in it. It tells us in Matthew 13 that the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. And that word for treasure actually means rich vein, a rich vein. And for those that know anything about mining, they find a bit and they just follow it wherever it goes. It'll go up, it'll go down, it'll go round in a loop, but they'll follow it where it goes and it'll go in that vein. And this is the case. Well, where does the vein of this treasure take us? What can we find? Well, it still feels like it's got nothing to say about it. With two judges in it, and there's nothing really said about them. And then we've a run-up, really, to the next chapter. So this whole thing about Ammon becoming the new enemy, and if you've already read ahead and you've had a look at what Judges 11 is about, you know it's Jephthah who comes, and Jephthah's one of my favourite judges they're all my favourite judges, but I like Jephthah. He's one that you kind of look at, and particularly because you've got this story, this tragic story of Jephthah and his daughter, which we'll look at next week, that kind of comes in, and there you are. But the chapter before this, well, chapter 9, it took us from this great story of Abimelech. We've come back from our summer break to go straight into this. And this, if you didn't know it before, you know it now, that Saul wasn't the first king of Israel, but Abimelech was the first king of Israel. And what a disastrous reign it was, laying the groundwork, really, for why following a visible man over the invisible Lord is just a really bad idea. So why didn't Samuel stop there? I mean, ultimately, if we talk about what it is, well, then we get to chapters 11 and 12, which is the raising of Jephthah as a judge and his defeat of the Ammonites, and then the ensuing civil war that happens between the Ephraimites and the people of Gilead on one side. And with those two giant events, Abimelech with the first disastrous kingship, Jephthah with a civil war and the destruction of the sons of Ammon, right in the middle is this tiny little chapter, chapter 10. Was there really any need to put it in at all? And it seems almost impossible to even bring a Bible study from this chapter at all in any way. But then we have to remember something. And that is what I've been trying to kind of make the point all the way along. You see, if you grab chapter 10 and just grab hold of it and read it, you know, and like we do with often many of the judges, particularly, you know, these are the realms of Sunday school teachers along the lines that they go through who each of the judges are. You look at them in isolation as though the book of Judges is this history book that's giving you what it was like before the kings, and then Samuel gives you what it's like under Saul and David, and then Kings gives you what it's like under everybody else. But of course, that's not what the book of Judges is. But if you look at the book of Judges like that, then Tola and Jair, woohoo, do the Sunday school lesson off the back of that, if you can. He had 30 donkeys and 30 sons and 30 cities, and fill 40 minutes with that. That's the day that you're hoping one of the short preachers is on, that you've got that one to kind of come and go. And then you think, and if we're doing one a week, so I've got to do 40 minutes on Tola, and all it tells us is he lived here for 23 years. Doesn't even tell us who his enemy was along the lines. And it just feels like there's nothing there. But when you take the narrative of the whole book and remember who wrote it? Samuel. And Samuel didn't write a potted history of Israel. But it's easy you can get to this point is he's kind of majored on the big guys and minored on the little guys. And sometimes these ones are called the minor judges. The 6 minor judges. 2 of them are here. Shamgar was the other one who got 1 sentence. At least we know we had an ox goad. And then at the end of chapter 12, there's 3 others that kind of come in. And one of them had 30 children and 40 children. And they were riding on donkeys as well. Seemingly, that's all you need to be a judge, is have a load of kids that ride donkeys around. I mean, you lived in Blackpool, you can be a judge. Everything's good in the elms of that. And when we grab hold of the fact that it isn't a potted history, giving you a little bit of history of what came after, but that Samuel is actually written a book for the people of his time, then what we're reading in this chapter starts to take a considerable significance, particularly when you connect it to the chapter that's just gone, the chapters that are coming, and exactly what it is that he's trying to teach. And what we know is that Samuel has taken his audience right back to where the judges started. That's what he does. That's the restoration that Samuel brings about. He takes them right back to where Joshua left them. And it's kind of like a whole book about not going forward but going backwards and ending up back where you started. Sometimes your life might feel like that. And the Christian life feels like that. And you think, why am I not as passionate as I was when I first started? All you're ever trying to do is get back the coal that you had when you first started instead of moving on into something that was ever a new promise. And that's exactly where Samuel has taken them. He's written this book to show them exactly how far they went back and how far they came to. And he's created the whole process. But of course, what we know, and we'll read it, is that they decided that that restoration means it should have a king now, because we can't go down this same road again. Now, last week when we looked at Abimelech and we looked at chapter 9, what we actually were honest about in the question to say that the thing about the book of Judges is it really makes you think that theocracies are bad ways of running countries. But actually, what the teaching was that kings are even worse ways of running countries, and theocracies aren't bad ways of running countries if it's not a theocracy under priesthood, but it's a theocracy under God, and everybody believes in God. And everybody fears God, not fears the stick of God, but fears separation from the Lord. And if they fear separation from the Lord, they'll do what they can to remain in the Lord. And think about that in your own lives. When you make those decisions and those choices, when it comes that overwhelming thought for you to say, I can't stick this out anymore. It's too hard to be a Christian. It's too hard to stay in church. It's too hard to stay in this church. It's too hard to do this, that, the other. What is it that stops you bombing out of the door and saying, never again am I going to do that? It's the fear of separation from God. Not necessarily from one another, but from the Lord. And that's where wisdom begins. Because it always keeps pulling you back, like trying to run down a corridor with a bungee tied to your back. If you don't know what one of them is, a giant elastic band, and you're running out the door, and all of a sudden you snap straight back into the building again. And you go, I can't even get out of here. What's going on? But you're grateful for that thing that pulls you back. Sorrow can come on any of us, and depression can come on any of us, and dark thoughts can come on any of us. And friends, sometimes it can happen because you haven't had enough sugar today, or you've had too much sugar today. Sometimes our chemicals within our own bodies can tell us that we're sad, and when we start doing the math, there's nothing that we're sad about at all. We just feel sad. And sometimes we're sad because we actually have a lot to be sad about. But when we have the Lord and His Spirit that holds on to us, then we know that fear of the Lord is the thing that holds us. Now, if the book of Judges is to warn against the folly of rejecting the Lord for a king, we might say, why didn't the book of Judges stop at the end of chapter 9? Because we've made that case now. We've made a really clear case to show, here's Abimelech, he leads for 3 years, and it's a disaster. Why? Because the fruit trees don't need a king. A bramble can't bring shade. We have a ruler. His name is Jesus. So why write a chapter 10 through to 21? And this is when people kind of challenge it, going, well, he's got to his point now. Samuel is here to try and show the people of Samuel's day the absolute folly of choosing a king. He's done it. So what more has he got to say on the subject? And he's got a lot more to say on the subject. We're only halfway through. In fact, we're not even halfway through the book. Today is the halfway point of the book. Ish. Well, kind of halfway through. Next section's halfway through the book. So why write so much more? Why put more? Surely there is nothing to say. And if you want a poignant last word that leaves an audience, and the short books, the next book we're looking at is the book of Ruth. He only needs 4 chapters to make his point in that one. There you go, chapter 9, we've got there. Here we go, we've gone through the judges, and you get through to Gideon, and then a guy who isn't even a judge, one of his sons, stands up, manages to make himself king, ruins the whole situation, almost starts a civil war, gets tribe fighting inside, commits war crimes and atrocities, and does everything that I told you would happen. Surely you guys need to rethink before you stand here and say, Samuel, your sons are no good. They can't be judges over us, so you need to give us a king. So what more can be said? Because clearly a lot more is going to be said. What more can be said? And having just read chapter 10, do you think we're even adding to that conversation? Do you think, And Janet's agreeing because she's right. Well, if we remember what the Lord said to Samuel about choosing an earthly king, there's something we need to take in account. So let's go back to that. Let's have a look at 1 Samuel chapter 8. And let's read verses 10 through to 17. 1 Samuel 8, 10 through to 17.
Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will do. He will take your sons and make them serve his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands, commanders of 50, and others to plough his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your men servants and maid servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourself will become his slaves."
Is that to the end? Verse 17. And just read verse 18 for me then, please, if you can.
When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you've chosen, and the Lord will not answer you in that day.
And you see, there's the key. Now, the thing about this is, it doesn't seem a lot to us, but the law of inheritance, you know, you read the end of the book of Numbers and you get all these kind of, you think, what a way to end a book like the book of Numbers when you're talking about if this daughter marries that son, then they don't get this land. And there's so many laws about keeping the land and keeping the inheritance and the importance of the inheritance. And the answer that comes along that is because the Lord has created a perfect governmental system where everybody has means. Everybody has something. Everybody has land that they can grow on. And then he's even created a system of welfare, shall we say, even a system of restoration for the people that are just lazy. That start with something, lose everything, and they get it back in the end once they've learnt the value of hard work. And that really is a perfect system. It's brilliant. They dispose of that to go for a system where you have taxation. A king who taxes the people and doesn't work but has the right to take a bit of everything. And the prediction of the Lord is, at the end of it, you will cry out. You will stand outside the Houses of Parliament with placards and saying, "We want an equal and perfect society." Well, you had one, and you turned it down. And you will cry for it, and you'll cry for it, and guess what? I won't intervene. And it makes clear that that's what we're seeing. It's, I won't intervene. Not I won't listen. I won't intervene. And the Lord keeps his word on that. Now, this is the aftermath, shall we say. The consequences of the corruption of a king is not what the king does. It's that God won't intervene when the king does it. You made the choice. As they say, it's your bed, you're going to lie in it. But that doesn't mean that he isn't still God to the nation, and he isn't still there for the people to go through. But you asked for a mediator between me and you, and so you shall have one. Until you get to the point where it doesn't work anymore. Now, when Israel rejected that advice, and Saul is chosen, then David, and then his line, the Lord didn't intervene at any point to take away the king. And there were plenty of bad ones in that list. Now, to say that the Lord wasn't involved is not true. The Lord was there all the way through. He was equally involved. And there were good kings, and there were bad kings that came along the line. And when, in the end, all of the kings and the kingly line came to the end with Zedekiah, when that whole process happens, it's an outpouring of wrath. But it's not the Lord intervening. It's the consequences of their actions. And that consequence is just like Abimelech's, a divided kingdom. And then in the end, destruction on your own people. Internal, fighting for the kingdom to the point where everything is gone And all you're left with is a city, and then you lose the city. And that's what happens. Just turn with me to 2 Chronicles 36. And let's read verses 11 to 21. This is the end of the kings. 2 Chronicles 36, 11 to 21. It is the last chapter in 2 Chronicles, for those of you that are looking. 11 to 21.
Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. But Zedekiah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, his God. He refused to humble himself when the prophet Jeremiah spoke to him directly from the Lord. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar. Even though he had taken an oath of loyalty in God's name, Zedekiah was a hard and stubborn man, refusing to turn to the Lord, the God of Israel. Likewise, all the leaders of the priests and the people became more and more unfaithful. They followed all the pagan practices of the surrounding nations, desecrating the temple of the Lord that had been consecrated in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their ancestors, repeatedly sent his prophets to warn them, for he had compassion on his people and his temple. But the people mocked these messengers of God and despised their words. They scoffed at the prophets until the Lord's hand could no longer be restrained and nothing could be done. So the Lord brought forth a king of Babylon against them. The Babylonians killed Judah's young men, even chasing after them into the temple. They had no pity on the people, killing both young men and young women, the old and the infirm. God handed all of them over to Nebuchadnezzar. The king took home to Babylon all the articles, large and small, using the temple of God, and the treasures from both the Lord's temple and from the palace of the king and his officials. Then his army burned the temple of God, tore down the walls of Jerusalem, burned all the palaces, and completely destroyed everything of value. The few who survived were taken as exiles to Babylon, and they became servants to the king and his sons, until the kingdom of Persia came to power. So the message of the Lord spoke through Jeremiah was fulfilled. The land finally enjoyed a Sabbath rest, lying desolate until 70 years were fulfilled, just as the prophet had said.
Now stay in 2 Chronicles for me. So what we see here is kind of a same principle. We have a king in Abimelech, and then a destruction, a division, and that is because the end of a king is exactly what the Lord says here. If you're going to choose one, I'm not going to intervene into it until there comes no other choice but an outpouring of wrath. And you understand, this isn't the Lord intervening between the king and the people. This is the Lord intervening between his name and his people. And in this process that comes, this is now the end of the kingdom of Israel. The kingdom of Israel never existed again, and will not exist again until Jesus returns. It ended on that date, and that was the end of it. That outpouring, but what does it say brought about that in the end? Well, they ignored every single messenger that was sent. They didn't just ignore them, they mocked them. They rejected the Lord. They followed the religions of everybody else. Ultimately, they walked so far from the Lord that it was his name in the end that had to be protected, and they thought because of his name he wouldn't do it. But what were the consequences of that choice? Well, it was the loss of everything. And for how long? What did verse 21 say? 70 years. And he uses this phrase, a Sabbath rest. And that's a strange statement, isn't it? But it's this 7 that's here in it. The 70 years is a Sabbath rest for the land. And when Nehemiah arrives, those very walls that Nebuchadnezzar pulled down, they still haven't gone up. And that's not 70 years, that's another 80 years on top of it. That he comes back to that, and he still aren't being built. That land had no usefulness in its whole time. Yes, some people remained. But the people that remained were the ones that had their hands out, not their sleeves rolled up. And that's why you read both Ezra and Nehemiah say, what news of Jerusalem? And there's sadness on them, because there are people there, but they're not doing anything. And there are so many churches up and down the country in the same state. They come along, and they're doing nothing to help the state of their church in any way, shape or form. They're just living in the decay of it, with their hands out looking for somebody to come and help them, instead of realizing the God-given calling to every one of us that we are the body of Christ. And such were we. At one point, hands out, not sleeves rolled up. And if you were sleeves rolled up, maybe you were the minority. And, you know, you hear this statistic in churches, the 80-20 statistic, that the sleeves rolled up people are the minority of the people who are going. And usually the people who are like that are the first in line whenever you've got food. And the last in line whenever you've got cleaning to be done, or you've got building work to be done, or evangelism to be done, or anything to do. I always watch out for the ones who are the quickest to take the food and the first out when the jobs have got to be done. And that is the case. But why did the Lord give Jerusalem this 70-year rest, or a week of Sabbath as it's called? Why did he give it them? Well, turn with me to Jeremiah 29. And we're going to read verses 10 to 14. So yes, we're going to get the verse. Jeremiah 29, verses 10 to 14. In context, yes.
I, the Lord, tell you, that's
Jeremiah 29.
For the Lord's, wait, what? 11.
Verse 10 to 14.
Okay. For the Lord says, only when the 70 years of Babylonian rule are over will I again take up the consideration for you, and I fulfill my gracious promise to you and restore you to your homeland. For I know what I have planned for you, says the Lord. I have plans to prosper you, not to harm you. I have plans to give you a future filled with hope. When you call out to me and come to me in prayer, I will hear your prayers. When you seek me in prayer and worship, you will find me available. If you seek me with all your heart and soul, I'll make myself available to you, says the Lord. Then I reserve your plate and your regather from all the nations and all the places which I have exiled you, says the Lord. I will bring you back to the place from which I exiled you.
There we go. So what we're seeing, the answer that comes here from the Lord. Well, you picked a king. You picked a king over me. I've warned you what will happen if you pick a king. You said we still want a king. So a king you shall have. Now, of course, we're talking here about 1 Samuel 8. We're not talking about Judges. We're talking about 1 Samuel 8, and they had a king, and they had a king for that time. They had Saul, they had David, they had Solomon, and they had all of David's line right the way through to Zedekiah, and then that's the end of it. And now a Sabbath, you need a time of rest, and then there'll be a restoration. The promise there, a time of desolation, a time, and what does that mean? Well, there's a consequence to choosing a king. The consequence of choosing the king is you will live in it, and then when it ends, there'll be a time of desolation, a time where there'll be a Sabbath rest, and then we'll talk about bringing about the kingdom. We'll talk about the final restoration. So how does that apply to Judges? Now, if you remember, I've told you that the Bible is pattern. Midrash. There's patterns that are repeated. And one of those midrashic rules is what they call small and big, or light and dark. So you get a small version of the event, which is then coupled with a large version of the event, or a large version of the event, and its pattern is a small version of the event. The large version of the choosing a king is the period of the kings. The small version of that is choosing Abimelech. If the large version has this long period of time of kings and then it ends with 70 years, the small version has a small time with the kings, 3 years, and then it has to end with 70 years. And if the large version of the king ends with the 70 years, and then it talks about the restoration and the kingdom of heaven, the small version has to lead into that too. Are you with me? In case your heads are a bit down. What I'm saying is that if we look at the time period of the kings, and we know it ends with the 70-year Babylonian and then Persian captivity with the return to Jerusalem. Well, the thing about the return to Jerusalem or at the end of the 70 years? When Jeremiah wrote that letter in Jeremiah 29, we know of at least one guy who read the letter. Daniel. Just turn me to Daniel 9 and verse 2.
In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, came to understand from the sacred books that according to the word of the Lord disclosed to the prophet Jeremiah, the years for fulfilling of the desolation of Jerusalem were 70 in number.
Now Jeremiah said at the end of the 70 there'll be a restoration, and Daniel said the 70 are up, Lord. So he starts to pray until the point that he faints. And then what do we read from verses 20 to 24 of Daniel 9?
While I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and making my request to the Lord my God for his holy hill, while I was still in prayer, Gabriel, the man I'd seen in the earlier vision, came to me in swift flight about the time of the evening sacrifice. He instructed and said to me, Daniel, I have now come to give you insight and understanding. As soon as you began to pray, an answer was given, which I have come to tell you, for your highly esteemed. Therefore, consider the message and understand the vision. Sorry, where is it?
Verse 24.
77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to total wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy.
So, Daniel reads the book of Jeremiah, he reads the letter that Jeremiah sent that said, after this time period of kings where I said I wouldn't intervene, now there will be a 70-year desolation period where the land will have rest, and then there'll be a restoration. Daniel says, where's the restoration, Lord? And the answer he gets back from the Archangel Gabriel is the Lord tells you it's 70 times 7 away. It's 70 weeks, it's called, and it means a week of years. So it's 70 times 7 years. What's 70 times 7 years? 490 years. So from the time that Daniel said that, the Lord said it would be 490 years. Now, you may be aware it's been longer than 490 years since Daniel said that, and you think, so is the Lord a liar? Because it's the complete restoration, the end of all things, and the coming kingdom. But what we know is there's a gap between the 69th week of years and the 70th week of years, which Daniel 9 goes on to say. But as a whole, it's 490 years. Hold on to that number. Hold on to that statistic. Hold on to what I'm saying. And just to recap so you don't lose it. In 1 Samuel 8, they ask for a king. The Lord says, I won't intervene if you should do this, and they do it. And they go through a long period of time with corrupt king after corrupt king after corrupt king, even with a few good ones thrown there in the middle, ends with this line. And just remember, Zedekiah's father, Josiah, was one of the best. So he grew up under one of the best. But Zedekiah mocks the prophet of God, and in the end brings about the destruction, trying to fight the people that the Lord has said they will go in. The principle after that is there will be 70 years rest. And then after that there will be 490 years, and then the beginning of the establishment of the kingdom of heaven. That's the big. So just a little follow the same pattern. Let's do some maths. Abimelech. Right then. How long, and it tells us that Tola judged immediately, how long does it tell us that Tola judged? It's in verse 2 of Judges 10. 23 years. How long does it tell us Jair judged? Okay, and then in verse 8, how long does it tell us the Ammonites oppressed Israel? In verse 18. So, For those of you that are paying attention, how many years is that altogether? 63 years that we're on. We're 7 short. Now turn to Judges 12:7. How long did Jephthah judge Israel for? 6 years. That takes us to the 69th year. And on the 70th year, which judge takes over? It's in Judges 12:8. Ibzan of Bethlehem. Now we say that all of the judges are a type of Jesus in one or a couple of ways. Who's Ibzan? He's another one that they say literally nothing about. Ibzan lived in Bethlehem. He also had 30 sons and 30 daughters. And he swapped his 30 sons for 30 secular sons and 30 daughters for... Yeah, anyway, it's all confusing. But the thing about Ibzan is this. On the 70th year, Ibzan, his name meaning splendid. The splendid one of Bethlehem. Oh, well, you're digging into that a bit, Jamie. You're making that fit, really, aren't you? On the 70th year, somebody else who happens to be splendid was also born in Bethlehem. So you're saying that. Well, let's add a bit more to it. Universally, all Jewish tradition and all Jewish rabbis teach that Ibzan is the title and not the name of this particular judge. His name is Boaz of Bethlehem, from the book of Ruth. And what was Boaz? He was a kinsman redeemer. Who's our kinsman redeemer? Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. So, what we're saying is, after Abimelech, the 70th year sees the restoration of the splendid one of Bethlehem. The king, the Goel, the kinsman redeemer, comes in. You might still be thinking that's nice, but surely just a coincidence. Well, let's put a pin in our 490 years now. Ibzan, we understand, died in 1075 BC. If we add 490 years, although we're actually subtracting because BC counts backwards, which is always confusing when you're trying to figure it out, takes us to 585 BC. The year that Zedekiah was taken into captivity. So from that moment, 70, another 490 years takes you to Jeremiah's 70. And of course the Lord said to Daniel, after this 70 is 70. Has that got you a bit excited? See, there's nothing in this chapter. Now you're thinking, oh, gosh. And if you're watching on the live stream and you're thinking, hang on a second, I need to get a piece of paper and work this all out again. It's important that we grasp hold of something like this. The Bible has many patterns in for us. From the small version of a king that takes us through to 70 and then to through 490. Takes us in the same place that the large versions of the kings takes us through 70 and then 490. With a gap in the middle of that one, which is the church age. And when that is finished, when Romans 11:25 says the fullness of the Gentiles is up. And of course, what does Ibzan do here? He takes all of his Jewish males and he puts them in the Gentiles. And he takes all of the Gentiles and he puts them in his female Jews. Exactly what happens in that church age. That Jerusalem is destroyed and the Jews are scattered into the nation. As you see here in this process that comes along, there's pattern that kind of jumps at us. Now, that might be hair on the back of your neck moments. It was for me earlier. I was getting excited about seeing this, and you go, but there's a danger in just kind of coming with some exciting kind of things, because it's a bit gimmicky. If I say, look at this exciting, and you go, oh, that is nice. But is that really what chapter 10's about? Well, no, it's not what chapter 10's about. But it's in here. See, this was an insignificant filler text. Felt like it fitted between Abimelech and Jephthah, two serious judges. We've got these two little judges. But actually what we're realizing is it now becomes the background to a 70-year period that's got three judges in it. Tola, Jair, and Jephthah. And it's an important period of time with an 18-year gap with no judge in it. It's an important period of time that ends with the beginning of Ibzan, and the most significant date to the reader who is reading it, who is one of Samuel's audiences, is because it's also the date when Samuel was born. At the end of the 70 years. The man who was tasked with the restoration of Israel was born. So as we've been reading the book of Judges, we've gone back all these years in the history to the reader. He's got to chapter 10, and he's now in his immediate history. If we talk about the history of our country, we can go back 70 years, and that's history that we've probably still got family living in. Some of you even are born in. But in that time period that we can look in there, the reader is now seeing his immediate history. Tola, Jair, and Jephthah, and the 18 years in the midst are not just the gap between Abimelech and them. It's their direct history that brings them to the reason that Samuel had to go on a restoration in the first place. The reason why the Ark of the Covenant was snatched by the Philistines and was taken away, and Ichabod was born in the nation. It's in their most immediate history. When we talk about our church history, we look at the 70 years and see how that impacted us and how we are still sometimes the products of what happened in there. And so it's not just interesting for us to know that Abimelech 17,490 and the king 17,490. It's important news to the life that they are in. Because if the pattern of God is to say that when you choose a king, when it's all over, this and then this, they're about to choose a king. And they've just experienced what the 70 is like. And they needed a restorer to bring them out of that period of desolation. That time period of rest. It's not insignificant to them. So chapter 10 really shows the consequences of a king period. But then it fills in the details of the 70 years till the restoration of the kingdom to the Lord. And over these next 3 weeks, these 3 chapters, 10, 11, and 12, are giving us the time period that takes us up to the birth of Samuel. That's important. Samson is a contemporary, as are the other judges at the end of chapter 12, after Ibzan, the other two, whose names have escaped me right now. These next 3 weeks give us the understanding, the history that detailed. And when we look at that history and think about it, well, it ends with Jephthah with a civil war between the men of Gilead and the men of Ephraim. And it's to this that Samuel starts to work. And we'll read when we get to the book of Samuel to see what was actually going on also in the priesthood at the time, as this is what was going in the political sphere of the world. And we'll see that the corruption is total. From government through to priesthood. And in every way, the theocracy failed because of the statement, a generation grew up that did things, they did what was right in their own eyes. But this 70 years gives us something important to help us to get to that. Because when we get to that, we're going to spend nearly a whole year after that looking at 1st and 2nd Samuel. And 1st and 2nd Samuel give us a very small period of history. And these next 3 weeks give us the history of Samuel, of Saul, of David. They're important. Everything led up to this point. The failed king, that's 70 years until a restoration of a kingdom that will come. So to Samuel's readers, the pain that they had come through, remember when Samuel turned up at the gate, the elders would go out and say, is it ill for us? All of that is found in chapters 10, 11, and 12. That's what they were living through for Samuel to have to deal with. And they should be understanding that the reason that Samuel didn't end the chapter in chapter 9, or look at chapter 9, is because he didn't just want to tell them how disastrous the reign of a king would be. He needed to tell them what happens after the disastrous reign of a king. Because what happened after the disastrous reign of the king is what happened after the disastrous reign of the kings. And the understanding that the kingdom of heaven, that very thing that the disciples asked Jesus at the beginning of Acts, so when are you restoring the kingdom to us? That whole phrase is born out of this statement, out of this place. So much of it is, and when we understand that, we're working to the very same kingdom. And that's why we have to make sure we don't make the same mistake of saying we want a king that we can see. We want a go-between between us and God. Because the Lord says, I'm not going to intervene. And then there will be a rest period between that end, that outpouring of wrath, and before. Because this is the pattern of the system. The cost to Israel wasn't just the kingdom, but the aftermath of returning to a people under the Lord. And as such, each part of these chapters gives the backstory that we need to understand Samuel's ministry and to understand how bad their choice was and why Samuel got so upset about it. Because he knew what the history was. So, that being said, that's what this chapter really is about. And I hope that's excited you to see this mathematical pattern and puzzle right here. What do we learn then from Tola and Jair? What do we learn about these two judges in their time period, other than the fact that they were there for 45 years? And there was donkeys and stuff. And the thing is, you know, that even sounds like a nursery rhyme element there at the end. You think, did they really have 30 sons on 30 donkeys with 30 cities? Or did that just conveniently rhyme? Did he choose that? Is this a rounding up of that number? What's going on here? Why is that even significant? You know, Deborah, she was a prophetess and sung a song, but Jair's got 30 donkeys. How does that even teach us anything about what the judges do? Well, actually, it does. I hope it's going to challenge a very widely held view about the judges. Because here's something about these judges. Who are their enemies? Well, it doesn't tell us. In fact, it doesn't really tell us that they fought against anybody. There was no nation that was challenging them. And there's no notion that the judges were raised up at all. But what is the commonly held belief about the book of Judges and the judges in the book of Judges is that we have this cycle of self-abuse. We're all with the Lord, then we walk away from the Lord, and we chase after foreign gods. The Lord raises up an enemy. We cry out to the Lord sends us a judge sorts out the enemy, we're back with God. Until we don't want to be back with God, and then we're back with the foreign gods again. But here's two, bearing in mind that Gideon saw off the last lot, and then for the remainder of Gideon's life there was nobody oppressing them. We get to this point, and Tola and Jair don't have any enemies. And I hope that teaches you something new about the judges, because they weren't raised up to fight off other enemies. Because they weren't. Not only were these two not, neither were the final three, apart from Samuel, Samson. They weren't here to fight anybody. And this notion that that's the only thing that judges are called out challenges what judges are about. They're not about winning victories. They're about doing the work of a judge, and we'll come back to that, but we saw it with Deborah. And I hope that teaches you something. But what it would seem to teach us is that when there isn't an enemy for them to fight against, Samuel doesn't have very much to say about them. Only a few sentences, or a sentence, about where they lived, where they died, and where they went. But again, now we know that the purpose of this chapter and the next two chapters are to show this period of 70 years until this coming restoration. And we know that Samuel isn't just filling in a gap here. He's actually trying to show us something. It's not just giving us a potted history till he gets to the important stuff. We realize there's something here, even though it feels like it's so meager. There's just nothing. Or if it is there, it's so well hidden. How are we supposed to see it? So what might we find then? Well, let's take Tola first. Let's have a look at Judges 10:1. Somebody want to read that out?
Abimelech there arose to save Israel. Tola, the son of Puah, the son of Dodo, a man of Issachar, and he dwelt in Shamir in the mountains of Ephraim.
Now we can understand that the phrase that he arose after Abimelech in order to defend Israel. But from what? And that is the right kind of understanding. So yours is like a New Living?
Yeah.
So the New Living says to rescue. So you've got deliver. So we've got defend, deliver, and rescue. But from who? It doesn't say that there's anybody to deliver and rescue, and from who. And that's why people look at this and go, well, clearly he just wasn't an important judge. Samson's an important judge. He gets 4 chapters. But this guy isn't an important judge. And whoever he was fighting must have been some kind of minor. But what we have to know is he was definitely here to deliver, to defend, to rescue Israel from something. And taken in isolation, what we're really looking for is some kind of external enemy. The Philistines, or the Ammonites, or the Amorites, or the Hivites, or all the ites, or the Jebusites, or anybody, really, even the French. Anybody who's come in to give them a ticking off, and he is told to finish them off in some kind of way, because we hear that phrase, we're looking for an external enemy, because to defend is to protect against that which comes from out. Except that that's not always true. The blow that hurts the most is not the one that comes from the front. It's the one that comes from the side or from behind. My sides are exceptionally sensitive. Anybody touches them, I'll squeal like a little girl. Up that, in any way, shape or form, to which my children know and punish me with on a regular basis. Is that the case? It's just, that's me. But the funny thing about that is Mike is exactly the same. So he's inherited that from me. And we are, like, this is why we walk around like this all the time. Now I've given that information to Sharon, I'm worried. So that, that comes along. Is the case. It hurts to be stabbed in the back. It hurts to be stabbed in the side. When you have got people who you are depending on to stand with you, and people you feel that you're safe from behind, you know, the armor of God doesn't have any armor that goes on your back. These are the places that we protect against the least, because it's not the place that we're expecting to be blowed against. Because this first verse links with Abimelech so much, it names him. It gives us the understanding that this is an immediate. In fact, your version says that. It's an immediate. Abimelech's dead. Tola's straight on with the job. And what is it that Tola is following? Well, he's following the collapse of a reign that didn't collapse because he hadn't paid enough tax. or he hadn't put enough money aside, or the people were unhappy, it collapsed with atrocities, with war crimes, and with fighting. And if you can kind of remember back, what we learned in our last chapter is that the battle raged. Well, where was the battle raging? Who was it raging between? Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's two sons. A civil war started because the promises of the Lord to Ephraim seemed to be coming true through the family of Gideon for Manasseh. But of course, Gideon had already rejected it. He said, "You're not making me or my sons king." Now, the thing about Abimelech is he was Gideon's son to a harlot. So he was a man of Ephraim. So he used the social situation, the unfairness and the worrying nature. He took advantage of all of those things to create an army and to get himself on the throne. And as it tells us in chapter 9, the Lord put a spirit between these men of Ephraim and the king of Ephraim. So that no longer were Manasseh involved in this. The battle was actually between Ephraim. Now you've got an inter-tribe civil war. You've actually got brother killing brother. There's a real fight going on. Now have a look at Judges 9, 45 to 49. Because they weren't just civil strife. This is what happened in the war. Just have a look. Let somebody read that. Judges 9, 45 to 49.
The battle went on all day before Abimelech finally captured the city. He killed the people, levelled the city, and scattered salt over all the ground. When the leading citizens who lived in the tower of Shechem heard what had happened, they ran and hid in the temple of Baal-bereth. Someone reported to Abimelech that the citizens had gathered in the temple, so he led his forces to Mount Zalmon. He took an axe and chopped down some branches from a tree, then put them on his shoulder. "Quick, do as I have done," he told his men. So each of them cut down some branches, following Abimelech's example. They piled the branches against the walls of the temple and set them on fire. So the people who lived in the tower of Shechem died, about 1,000 men and women. Then Abimelech attacked the town of Tibez and captured it. There was a strong tower inside the town, and the men and women and the entire population fled to it. They barricaded themselves in and climbed up to the roof of the tower. Abimelech followed them to attack the tower, but as he prepared to set fire to the entrance, a woman of the roof dropped a millstone that landed on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull.
Let's stop there. Now, if you were getting into it then. See, this wasn't just a bit of civil strife. He burned a tower with women and with children. He sowed salt over the ground so that nothing else could grow. This was not a kind of a war or a battle or a land grab. It was a war of annihilation. It was the very definition of what a Holocaust is. They were trying to wipe out, but it wasn't the Philistines trying to wipe out Israel or the Ammonites trying to wipe out Israel. It was the people of Ephraim trying to wipe out the other people of Ephraim. That was brother not just falling out with his brother, but trying to bury him under the patio. And there are days, aren't there, Stephen? There are days. He looked at me and went, "Never, never, I would never do that." And I said, "I tell you, my brother, there were days. There were days." Oh, yeah. I once went at him with a pair of scissors. And when I stabbed him with them, they bent on his back. But there you go. Good job for me and him that they bent on his back when I went out there. It was a homicide that day. But brothers fighting is one thing. But trying to wipe, how do you come back from that? How do you as a tribe heal those kind of wounds? You know, if we take this, sometimes we can read the Bible like it's a story. Like we're reading something like Aesop's Fables. And of course that's the wrong way for us to think of it. We're reading a living book, yes. We're reading a teaching book. These are real people. And we can understand the concepts of the reality of our lives. And if we were putting ourselves in that situation, yet alone with all of our modern understandings and technologies and the ways that we think, if we were in that situation, how would we recover? You know, people struggle with one another because of that. There was a lady in my church. She was a Jamaican lady. Her husband died in a mining accident, and a Nigerian man who was involved at the particular time, he managed to somehow swing the whole thing so that none of the compensation came to the family in any way, shape or form, and put it in that way. And this one woman, she hated that man so much that she hated all Nigerians. Not just this one man, the entire nation of Nigeria. And, well, that's a different nation. The whole nation of Nigeria. So much so that when her daughter ended up marrying a Nigerian man, it was questionable as to whether she was even going to go to the wedding in any way, shape or form. That's one person, yet alone a whole tribe of people living in the same area with the constant understanding that the reason that my mum, dad, grandma, sister is not at the dinner table with me is because your mum, grandma burnt them alive in a tower. And that's a complex situation to which Tola was sent to defend, to rescue, to support, to strengthen, because not all the enemies are without. Something had to be rebuilt. See, we use this phrase, 70 years of desolation. And every time I say desolation, I keep thinking about The Hobbit. But every time you say desolation, you're thinking about something that's going to be a whole time of collapse. But that isn't what happens in either of the 70 years. The 70 years' time is the land just lies fallow. Nothing more restful for a land than when it lies fallow. And the same here. The land isn't lying fallow, it's going through a healing process. And those 23 years that Tola is there, well, where does it say that Tola is from? Issachar. Now that, again, might just pass us by. But he's not from the tribe of Ephraim. He's from the tribe of Issachar. Now, first of all, you think, well, clearly, nobody from Ephraim was going to pull the people of Ephraim together. They don't trust one another. It needed to be a mediator from one of the other tribes. But we neglect to understand. When a man from Issachar left Issachar, what was he leaving behind? He was leaving his inheritance behind. Now, in all of Scripture, when people leave inheritance, you have, Naomi's husband. He leaves his inheritance. He doesn't trust in God anymore. He goes off to the land of Moab. Everybody you read about leaving their inheritance, like the Danites, will come to that in Judges 17. They're not in a good place with God. It's not a good thing that they've done it. But here is a man who makes a self-sacrifice to give up his own inheritance for the good of the whole nation. And we just put Israel as one great big title. But Israel was, in fact, 13 tribes that was tied together by their connection to the Lord. And that's what we see in the book of Judges, is often the tensions between those tribes. If you think Jacob and Esau become two completely different tribes. So it would make complete sense that the 12 tribes of Israel should really have become 12 separate nations. But the Lord keeps them together under the name Israel, the name of their father, and they become, and the tension becomes too great to the point that after Solomon, under Rehoboam, there is a split. And we saw in the book of Joshua there was nearly a split over the River Jordan, and the tribes that were on the east and the tribes that were on the west. We'll read in a couple of weeks' time that there is again another civil war because there's a strife. The people of Issachar see themselves as Issacharites. The people of Ephraim see themselves as Ephraimites. That's what they see themselves first, and then they see themselves as Israelites. And being from the United Kingdom, we could say that same principle. There was a time that people wrote, every time when they were asked what their nationality was, that they were British. But today, more and more people write, I'm English, I'm Welsh, I'm Cornish, because they're desperate for their independence. They never get it. But they're Scots. I mean, that's it. You only have to watch a rugby match. And that's it. I mean, you watch a rugby. I remember being at a Christian men's conference, and Wales were playing England. Oh my goodness. You could have started a fight in that room, and we were all Christians in that, and that's it. Of course, the Welsh national anthem comes up. The Welsh are all banging the chest like this. They've all brought the Welsh rugby shirts. You're at a men's conference. What have you brought a rugby shirt with you for? Who even knew there was going to be a TV there? But there they were, they're up. And then, of course, the Sweet Chariot comes on, and all the English are up singing that. And there's almost a scrum going on in the tent, because that nationality that comes. And many of us think of ourselves as Welsh, as English. Or some of us as Congolese. But before, and then we think of ourselves as British. And the last thing that most of us think of ourselves then is European. But that's a different story altogether, isn't it? No. I remember being on an aeroplane in America, and the guy next to me said, "Well, you Europeans, aren't you?" I said, "No, we're British." And he went, "Oh, I didn't realise it was that attention." I said, "Yeah." I said, "Just so you know, if you ever run into this again, we're English." And he went, "All right, wow, I've learned something here then." There you go. Their understanding, they saw that. So a man of Issachar giving up his inheritance to go and solve their problems. And it wasn't a case of, well, when I've sorted this, I can go back home. He died in Ephraim, and he was buried in Ephraim. Goodness knows if he had children. Where did they live? Did his land get given up altogether? Was it sold to another? Who has it? Where is it? And if we understand that, it tells us quite a lot, actually, about this man. And quite a great deal. How does a tribe recover from brother killing brother? Especially when the way that they killed one another is such a great crime. And the Lord raises up this man who seems to be a great judge, actually. A very self-sacrificing one, who gives up his own rights in order to help to us up. Now, of course he doesn't speak to us, but when we see the importance of inheritance, it says a lot. Tola is giving up the tending of his land to defend and bring peace to a region so divided and troubled. Who says he'll ever even be successful? Thus Tola links to the past. He links to Abimelech. He holds the story of Abimelech, the history of Abimelech, with one hand. And now with this hand, he's drawing into the history of Samuel. Because have a look at Judges 12:1. 40 years after Tola, this is what happens to Ephraim.
Then the men of Ephraim gathered together, crossed over towards Zaphon, and said to Jephthah, "Why did you cross over to fight against the people of Ammon, and did not call us to go with you? We will burn your house down on you with fire."
Now, if I was Tola, I'd be sitting home and going, well, that was worth my time, wasn't it? They had peace for 40 years after his death. They had a restoration that God centered on them to bring it about and to bring that peace. And so, if this whole 70 years has been pulled together here, Tola holds that side of the history and this side of the history together. He brings them together quite nicely, because Ephraim headed up a civil war. But who was that civil war against? It was against the men of Gilead, who the next judge, Jair, is a man of. So the history of these two is the end history of Jephthah. Because Ephraim went against Gilead. And the Lord sent Tola for Ephraim and Jair to Gilead. The men of Gilead. Now, I don't know about you, Bible geography confuses me. And they say that he went from here and he turned and he went up to such and such a place, and then he crossed this river and he went there and he went over this mountain. And I'm on a map going, I have no idea where on earth they are in Israel, because this is me, I get completely lost. And then I have to look at some Bible program and go, show me on the map where this is. And I go, well, that is not where I thought it was. No, that's it. And often a lot of the locations are kind of lost from us. But Gilead is a name that comes up a lot, and it will come up a lot in the king periods. But who's the tribe of Gilead? Well, there isn't one. Just so you're aware, there isn't. So how can they go against the... So who are they? If they're not a tribe, who on earth are they? Are they foreigners living in the town? Who and what is the people of Gilead? And when I hear that phrase, and there's no tribe of it, you want to know who they are. Well, let's have a look. Turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 3, and let's read verses 12 to 17. Deuteronomy 3, 12 to 17. Oh, he's got his phone. 12 to 17.
And this land which we possessed at the time, from Aroer, which is by the river Arnon, and half the mountains of Gilead and its cities I gave to the Reubenites and the Gadites. The rest of Gilead and all Bashan, the kingdom of Og, I gave to half the tribe of Manasseh. All the region of Argob with all Bashan was called the land of the giants. Jair, the son of Manasseh, took all the region of Argob as far as the borders of the Geshurites and the Maccathites, and called Bashan after his own name, Havoth Jair to this day. Also I gave Gilead to Machir, and to the Reubenites and the Gadites I gave from Gilead as far as the river Arnon, the middle of the river as the border as far as the river Jabbok, the border of the people of Ammon, the plain also with the Jordan as the border from Chinnereth as far as the east side of the Sea of Arba, the Salt Sea, below the slopes of Pisgah.
So it's a name that's for everybody who's on the east side of the Jordan. Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh. Instead of constantly saying Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh, which takes a long time, you could just say the men of Gilead. The men of Gilead actually represent these on this side. Now, the men of Gilead foresaw this as an issue. They could see the potential that one day the people of Israel who lived on the west side would turn around and say, we have no part with you. They foresaw an occasion where they would be separated from the kingdom. And so they tried to build that. Well, it wasn't an altar, it was a memorial. And it nearly started a civil war then, in the line. And that was in the end of the book of Joshua, if you can remember back to that period when we looked at that. So it really represents all the people who are on the other side of the Jordan. So when we get to Judges 12, the civil war we will see is one between the east and the west side. Now that's a massive thing. They're starting to create two different identities, two different ideas. Which side is the tabernacle on? It's on the west side. Which side is the great tower with the 10 words written on? It's on the west side. Which side was the promised land? The west side. No, actually, all of it is in the land that was promised. But there's a side about this. And we're starting to see now tensions that are arising. So that's who the men of Gilead is. And to them, Jair is sent. Because we're not at the civil war yet. And that's not what Jair is sent to stop. Jair is here after the 23 years of Ephraim's healing. And he's sent with his 30 sons and his 30 donkeys and his 30 cities. And when you're looking at Tola and going, ooh, that was a great kind of bit of information. What is this nursery rhyme going to help us with? What is this going? What do we learn here apart from other than the fact that, well, and I'm not kidding here when I say that almost every commentary says that what this just says to us is that Jair was prosperous because he had 30 sons. It tells us he was busy, but it doesn't tell us he was prosperous. That's it. I can say, if it was one wife, poor woman. No, that's a good, yeah. But I don't think it was one wife. I think it would have been several of them. We were having this discussion over tea when my youngest daughter said, some of them could have been triplets, Dad. That's true. So you get 10 wives with triplets each. Well, that's just good luck, really. So that kind of comes along that line. But either way, if the only thing that's significant about Jair is he had time to have 30 children, it doesn't really make him a very good judge. There's plenty of people in the children of Israel who've got that time on their hands. You know, Hannah was one or two along the line. So we understand that there's got to be a bit more about it. Because Manasseh wasn't divided like Ephraim was divided. The men of Gilead weren't needing to be healed like Ephraim needed to be healed. It doesn't even say in this one that Jair had to defend against anyone. So why did the Lord raise this judge up, and what did he do? Well, what did he do? He had 30 sons. He put them on donkeys, and they all had their own town. That's lovely. And the thing about those towns is they're called Havoth Jair. Now, the word Havoth means town. So the towns of Jair is what they're called. It says cities, and when you think cities, you're thinking 30. Oh, yeah, 30 Manchesters, based all around the area. But no, actually, there were 30 hamlets. But if you heard, Micah read it there in Deuteronomy, they weren't named by Jair. Well, not this one. They were named by one of Manasseh's sons, a Jair, who captured them from Og, and he named these 30 places Jair, Havoth Jair. So what we're saying is, now with some 300 years in the history, Jair has had to go back and take the places of his namesake. Take them back and put them in. Now what jumps out at you from these? Well, what jumps out at me, 3 things. The number 30, donkeys, and then every town has the same name. Which would be confusing if you're trying to look on a map and figure out where you are. Well, I'm near Havoth Jair. Which one? Not helping that they're all reasonably close to one another. I'm near one of them. So let's have a look at that backwards. If every town has the same name, what do we call that today when every takeaway has the same name or every supermarket has the same name? We do call it chain. It's branding. The thing about McDonald's, apart from the fact that almost our entire church works there now, and all I want to know is, what is that going to do for me when I go to McDonald's in Blackburn now that half the youth group works there? I want to know, are free burgers coming my way? This is all that's important that are coming along. But let's say we take McDonald's. The thing about McDonald's, other than that the food is awful, but we still keep getting drawn back to it, like KFC, is that you know what you're going to get whether you go to the Ewood one or if you go to the one in town or if you go to the one that's up towards Great Harwood. Yes, Whiteburg, that's the one I mean. Great Harwood is the nearest I can remember to say. You've got to go for a Richton before you get there, but that one. So there's 3 of them. Well, you know that a Big Mac's the same in all 3 of them. You know that the sandwich is the same. Now, the surroundings might be slightly different, but there's a branding to it. You know that the seats are going to be the same. You know what the place looks like. You know what the boxes are going to come in. You know what the nuggets are going to be like. You even know what the taste is going to be like, because whether you go to a McDonald's here or you go to a McDonald's down in London, it's a brand. They buy the burgers from the same place. They're cooked in the same way. They're given the same seasonings. They're given all these things. So if you name 30 towns after the same name, then there's a reason behind it, and the reason is not so that you can easily get lost on a map, but it's so that when you go to Havoth Jair, you're expecting to be able to get the same thing in every Havoth Jair. Now, this isn't that this judge opened up his own line of burgers. that actually he is the judge of Israel because he created the Bethany burger, where he understood that it might be that man can't live by bread alone, but between a Bethany burger between each slice. And that's a great slogan. There you go. Put that one on. But don't look at me like that. That was better than that. It deserved more. But actually, there is something you're expecting to get in each one that should be similar. So what? What are you supposed to get in each one? Well, that takes us to the next thing. Our donkeys. No, we're not back on burgers here. Our donkeys. So we get here, everybody's riding on a donkey. Well, I know you already know the answer to this. When somebody comes on a donkey, what's he coming for? Peace. On a horse, it's for war. On a donkey, it's for peace. And here's the principle of the line. So if we understand that it doesn't say donkey by accident, it's not trying to show Luke Jair was wealthy, he could afford to give each one of his kids a car. It was the line, and if only a Mike, if only. If we save up now, Maisie may get one. So that's it. But the actual side of it is that there's peace here. Now the 30 jumps out to us because that's the amount that Judas has paid for betraying Jesus. However, just turn with me to Exodus 21:32, because this is the value of 30. Exodus 21:32.
If the ox bores a male servant or a female servant, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver, and the ox must be stolen.
Now take that as a sideline from what we're looking at. That gives you the fact that when Judas went to the high priest and said, "What will you pay me to betray Jesus?" the price that they laid on him was the same price for a servant. Which isn't a lot of money, actually, 30 pieces of silver. The number 30 has a reference to slaves, to the price, to the cost of a slave. So that's a typological answer. And the number 30 is a reference to the idea that this was a servant. Jair was a servant, and he used his sons as the extension of his service. And each one had a land, a town, to which, after the name of Jair, any man in Israel could go and receive the same thing that they would receive if they went to Jair. That in that place, it would come to them at peace. So Jair extended something, but what did he extend? Well, Jair was a judge. But he wasn't a judge that's here to fight an enemy. He was a judge. Well, if we remember from Deborah, let's have a look back at that. Judges 4, verses 4 to 5. What do we learn here?
Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time, and she would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim. And the children of Israel came up to her for judgment.
So people went to the judge for judgment. It was Barak that fought the battle, not Deborah. And although Deborah went with him, it was Barak that was the fighter, but he wasn't a judge. Deborah was the judge. People didn't go and look for her to win the battle. They went to her for judgment. So what kind of judgment? And that's exactly what it means. But Deuteronomy 17, verses 8 to 13, gives us the understanding of their role. And we forget this easily because we see judges fighting battles. But this is what the judge is supposed to do. Turn with me to Deuteronomy 17. Let's read verses 8 to 13. This is what Jair is doing. Deuteronomy 17, verses 8 to 13.
If a matter arises which is too hard for you to judge between degrees of guilt for bloodshed between one judgment or another, or between one punishment or another, matters of controversy within your gates, then you shall arise and go up to the place which the Lord your God chooses. And you shall come to the priests, the Levites, to the judge there in those days, and inquire of them. They shall pronounce upon you the sentence of judgment. You shall do according to the sentence which they pronounce upon you in that place which the Lord chooses, and you shall be careful to do according to all that they order you, according to the sentence of the law in which they instruct you, according to the judgment which they tell you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or the left from the sentence which they pronounce upon you. Now the man who acts presumptuously and will not heed the priest who stands to minister there before the Lord your God, or the judge, that that man shall die. So you shall put away the evil from Israel, and all the people shall hear and fear, and no longer act presumptuously.
So, there's an important role here. So if we think Judges 9 showed us a theocracy doesn't do very well, but a kingship does even worse. Theocracy doesn't do well when you don't believe in God. Theocracy doesn't do well when you don't understand the rules and you don't understand the law. It is the judge's job actually to make the understanding of the law. And so it was for them to make the difficult decisions on which the law did not seem clear. So it's got to be, first of all, you want to be under that. You want to be under that principle of the law because it creates the society with which you live in. But the law isn't vague. It's not the vagueness of the law, it's the vagueness of the law in interpretation. Sometimes it's hard to say, well, I'm in this situation. See, I like board games. And sometimes you do something on a board game that the designers never thought you were going to do, and they don't really have a ruling for it. So everybody on the table has to kind of agree on a new ruling, and you have to make a decision. It's called in-table decision-making. And if all you ever play is Monopoly, you'll never have to do things like that. You play real board games, like I play. The kind that take 8 hours just to set up, yet alone play. You need to take a week off work to be able to play one round of. They're the kind of board games I play, but you have these kind of rules. You need to make a judgment. The person, the judge, that character, is here to help with the vagueness of interpretation, because we can be vague dependent on our personal reasons. We might want a certain circumstance. We might not know the answer to all the questions. We might have things. And in the end, we interpret a rule based on what works best for us. So, the speed limit is bad when I get caught speeding, and good when they hit my child with a car. But 30 miles an hour doesn't change. But your understanding of that law changes depending on your situation. And of course that's the problem. When you come at the law wanting to interpret from where you stand, that's why the statue of law is blind. Because the law has to be dispassionate. So the judge didn't have to have secret knowledge, didn't have to wisdom like Solomon, didn't have to know all the laws, as some suggested. All that they had to have access to, well, the judge was the constant. They were dispassionate in the point. It really doesn't matter whether you think 30 miles an hour is too slow or you think it's too quick. This is the law, and it is my job as the judge to rule that you shouldn't have been traveling at 30 miles an hour, even if you were going somewhere. So as the judge, I am ruling on what the law says, because my is the law, not your situation. That's why we need a judge. Not because the law is vague, but because what we want it to do, we can make it vague. And that's why we have it. The judge was a constant source. They were not looking at it from your point or your opponent's view. They were looking at it from the Lord's point of view. Now here's Jair. See, Deborah was a prophetess, and she was called to judge. But Jair was just a judge. And he was called to judge. One, typologically, a servant who in peace created a place. And what did he create? He created a superstructure where anybody in Israel, could go and find out the answer to a dispute. In other words, the issues of, and there arose in Israel people who had their own opinions about what was right and wrong. Here was a system that stopped that needing to happen. If you had a trouble with it, Jair had created a system through his sons and through the towns, which created that great thing. And that's brilliant. And for 22 years it was successful. Then we read in Judges 10 verse 8. From that year, they harassed and oppressed the children of Israel for 18 years. That very year, this is what happened. Then the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. 22 years of a great system of law that helped you to understand the very nature of what God wanted in your life. And before his body was cold in the grave, they were worshipping it if it moved. And even if it didn't move. That's incredible. That is astounding. That they could collapse from their relationship to the Lord. But it gets even worse, because it says at the end of verse 6, they forsook the Lord and did not serve him. And it says in verse 13, this is the Lord saying, you have forsaken me. Now, up until now, the children of Israel have worshipped other gods and God. But now we read something that they kicked the Lord to the touch. Less than a year after 45 years of peace. Now, what's important about that is that teaches us something. Have a look at 1 Corinthians 9, 24 to 27. (1 Corinthians 9, 24 to 27).
Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. No, I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I preach to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize.
Now, here's the important principle. Some people read that and they talk about, this is why we can't sin. If we sin, and if we sin, then we have to be removed from position, from office, from everything. We can sit in the congregation, that's fine. But if that's true, then that flies against everything that the Bible teaches us, that we were created for a purpose. As though our sin has now precluded us when the Lord didn't already know that we were sinners. And that pulls you back to the idea that once you've accepted Jesus and you've stepped into that thing that he's called you to do, you now need to be sinless. And the minute you do, we're going to drop a ton of bricks on you. So all that makes you do is make sure nobody ever finds out that you sin. And you put on a whitewashed face. Paul isn't talking about disqualification because you sinned. The children of Israel didn't sin a little, and they didn't sin a lot. And that's not what the problem is. The problem is that they forsook the Lord. In other words, they gave him up. And that's why the Lord said, I've given you up. And you've walked away from me. You haven't said me and you as well. This isn't like Elijah. How long will you have the prophets of Baal and the Lord as God? Choose one or the other. This is, we're making our choice. But it's bizarre, because how have they come to that decision? 45 years of peace. The restoration of the healed wounds of a civil war that saw war atrocities, and 22 years of perfect understanding of the will of God and the understanding of the law. Of course the next thing you're going to do is abandon God. That makes perfect sense. In any way, shape or form. And that throws this idea. That's why Paul says in that, be careful. He's not saying if you sin, you're gone. He's saying be careful, because as you run and as you race and as you get up, like athletes do, at 5 in the morning, and they go and they do, young people. I had a friend who was she was a javelin thrower. She was training, she was Olympic standard. She would wake at 4 in the morning. She would do her training. She would have a breakfast, do her homework, go to school, come back, do some training, do some homework, do some more training, go to bed, get up, and that was her life for the next 5, 6 years as she's building. And we look at that and go, I'll watch it on TV. That seems better, that kind of thing. But of course, that's athletes. They're driven people. really, in that sense. And we're told to be driven, in a sense. I'm not saying you've all got to get up at 4 and that's the way that it works. But that sense of driving is what Paul's talking about. But as you all looked at that and went, yeah, no, I don't want that kind of life, it's because, can you imagine on the life of a 6, 7, 8-year-old? Oh, it sounds exciting for a week, for a month, maybe even for a year. For me, the first day. But for everybody else, but there comes a point where you feel like you don't have a life. Because all your life is eat, sleep, train, homework, throw a javelin, and this, that, and the other. And in her case, the heartbreaking side of it is she developed a muscle injury that could never be healed. So she spent 6 years developing and never got to be the Olympic athlete that she trained to be. And that's the point where you can go, you know what, stuff it for a game of soldiers. I'm off. And Paul says, be careful, because you don't get disqualified unless you leave the track. Don't leave the track. But the children of Israel have left the track, and for no good reason. We're not given one. That's frustrating. But the only thing that we understand is this is in the 70 years. And at the end of it, Samuel will come. 45 years. The next 25 years will be oppression, fighting, civil war, then the Philistines. That 7-headed kingdom. This teaches me that from a sound base and strong teaching, a nation can fall in a year. And it tells you where people can fall in a year. So friends, that's why you need to come. You ever keep telling yourself, I'm a strong Christian. I don't need the fellowship of other people. Don't fool yourself. Because these guys had it all. And it took them less than a year to end up there. It can happen quicker than you think. And here's the thing, is reading a book a year doesn't sound a long time. But in our lives, a year can be an eternity. It can be a long time. A month can be a long time. Depending on the times that's going through. Anything can happen in that. And the reference that kind of comes here is this. When they walked away from the Lord, when they forsook him and they went their own way and they chose the other gods, they didn't get one enemy. They got them all. But they didn't get them all in some kind of confederated states warfare against Israel of annihilation. They just got them all coming, one after another. I've just finished with the wasps, now I've got the bees, and then I've got the hornets, and now I've got the ants. And then I've got the ticks. It's all coming. I think I've dealt with one and another, and then the bees come back again. It's over and over and it's over. And they did it for 18 years before they came to their senses and went, Lord, we sinned. We need you. And they have to do the same thing that the men of Nineveh do. They're not given a way out. But they act in a repentant manner. And we're shown once again, the heart of God is, even when repentance isn't on offer, he listens to a repentant heart. Now thank goodness for the Lord. His mercy and kindness and goodness that comes out to us. But because chapter 10 is also giving us the backstory to the rise of Samuel and the reason he came, chapter 10 now finishes with this understanding. It now focuses on the next enemy. And it focuses on the next territory. It focuses on the men of Gilead. Because they're on the west side. So the east side. And then it focuses on the men of Ammon. But something's changed. Gilead is where this conflict now settles. And an enemy, which we're going to look into more next week. Ammon. Where did Ammon come from? He is the son of Lot. From his incestuous relationship with his daughter. Born in a cave with his brother Moab. The lands that they inherited were the lands that Abraham said to Lot, you take one side and I'll take the other. And when the children of Israel came into the land, the Lord said, don't touch the land of Moab. And the Lord had no relationship with Og and Shion. And you can take that land. And I'm not giving it back to Ammon. It's yours, Israel. What happens now? Well, every one of our judges has fought against raiders who've come and stolen crops and oil and fruit and livestock and money and women and tents, in that order. But now the enemy doesn't want crops or money or oil or women or livestock. They want the kingdom. They've come for the kingdom now. They've come for the Lord's land. They've come to take away what was given by the Lord. They've come to snatch away what was given by promise and by inheritance. What was given and what they should protect. The very least, that's what the enemy has now come for. The battle for the kingdom has now begun. And friends, it's still not ended yet. But this is where it began. A war that we've still been fighting. So for this chapter that had nothing in it, we found quite a lot. Does anybody have anything that's jumped out to them or any questions they want to ask before we finish? Yes, they do. That's quite right. So, yeah, what you're reading there in verse 13, go and see if your other gods will save you. Because, again, it's this inexcusable or even, I don't know about you, I've tried to get my head around it today. I can't get my head around it. Why did they choose this? You know, there are people who leave the church, not necessarily leave the Lord, but they leave the church and they are angry at God. Sometimes it can be because of what's been said from the pulpit or what's been said from the congregation, the way that they've been treated or the way that they've behaved. And people leave and they're hurt and they're angry, and sometimes they say all kinds of things. And although I don't condone it, you can understand it. But it's the bizarrest thing, and you know what, I've experienced it here, where you've helped people through a difficult time, you've supported them, you've stood by them, you've strengthened them when they found something very difficult. It's got to that point where everything is going well for you, and they shake you by the hand and say, we're going to go to the church up the road. And you can't get your head around it. Now, I'm not so precious about that because this is all the kingdom of heaven. But it's when people do that and they say, you know, I don't think Christianity is for me. If you've lost 3 children and you've gone through a hard time and you feel like the Lord's not there and you've had cancer and you've gone through all these battles and you don't think anybody stood by you, I could understand you coming and say, I don't think this is for me. But when everything's gone well for you, but you know what? We're going to try a different God for a while. See if that works out any better for us. When the Lord couldn't have done any more for you in that time period. It's bizarre. So that phrase, go see if they'll help you. Actually, you're right, the prophets echo it for the same reason. We read it in 1 Corinthians 8, when the people of Corinth say, we know that there's nothing in here. Not even demons, they're just stone statues and idols. They mean nothing, so could we please eat some meat? The Lord needs them to understand. He may have the title Lord of Lords, King of Kings, God of gods, but he isn't God of gods. There are no other gods. There is no lesser beings in that sense. Let's not give demons some kind of authority and control. And this is a clear understanding that we need to say. We have neither been taught to go after demons, nor to look out for them. When we cast the demons out of somebody, they don't go. We don't destroy them. We haven't just mortally stabbed them. They go somewhere else. The freedom of one person is the misery of somebody else. Now, we need to have that in our head when we're thinking about this. And the church sometimes gives too much power along to the enemy. Remember, he creates nothing. He corrupts everything. And we give him all sorts of things. Oh, well, rock music, that's his. I'm not thinking that we could have any kind of influence in that kind of area or way. And there's this, I'm not going to kind of riff on this for a long time, but there's a story about one particular rock group, and I can't remember the name of them, but they were church-going. This is right in the 50s, and they played a song in there, a rock and roll song, and the next day the pastor absolutely ripped them apart from the pulpit and said, we'll have no Christian young men being involved whatsoever in this kind of scene or anything. Now just imagine if that guy had got behind them, what influence Christianity could have had in the rock and roll scene. Now, I'm not so naive as to think that the world is the world, and I know exactly where it would have ended up. But we don't help ourselves sometimes by taking all of these things and going, no, that's the devil's. No, he doesn't own anything. Our job is to go back there and snatch back what he's taken from us. Because that's his plan. He's come for the kingdom. He's not happy for your crops. He wants your land. And we've got to stop him taking it. Friends, there's too many churches that are pool halls, snooker clubs, wine bars, and Des-Res apartments. These stones cry out of the Creator, the Lord God, and of a nation's heritage and history. That says at one time and other people believed this. Let's not give the enemy. And sometimes the Lord challenges us with that and go, well, go on. Go and ask him for help. Go and get your help from your stone statues, because they can't do anything. The stone idols, they're inferior animals. He is God in heaven. All hail the Lamb. Amen. Anything else that jump out at anybody? Yeah. Yeah. And I think that there's a real sense of that. That complacency can come in. And another statistic kind of thing. If you think through the Cold War period, you have this iron wall that goes through Europe. You've got the West, where the church is legally allowed, and it goes from its kind of roots, its early 20th century roots, to becoming quite complacent, quite flabby, quite, in a sense, really more about all kinds of more party kind of things than it is about the real message that it is. Now you take the church on the other side of the curtain, where it's utterly illegal, and they're passionate about it. That, shall we say, the fight that they've got is why when we have Platform 67, they can give us a testimony of a church in North Korea that's got 8 people meeting in a hole. And, you've got some pastors wouldn't get out of bed for a church of 8. I'm not preaching to that many people. And it's like a revival in North Korea. In the places that you get, you understand that there can be. So it's funny, really, they say that without some kind of persecution, well, then we obviously don't want to wish that on ourselves. Oh, Lord, please send us some kind of hardship so that we start trusting in you. When mostly we're praying, Lord, please take these hardships away from me. But we have to understand that when that comes to the case, we have to listen to the teaching to Laodicea. We have to buy. We have to force ourselves now to pray, to worship, to attend, because there's nothing that's compelling. As they say, there's no atheists on a sinking ship. But there's plenty on a sunny cruise. God has to be God in the summer as well as the winter. Can't just be God when you need him. I'm going to pull you out of the bag now, Lord, because I need you right now. We need him both times. And when we're joyful and when we are. And I agree with that. And if anything, that really cries out to it more than anything. And if that is true, and you connect that with that, then it really does show you that it doesn't take very long for that to go. That can switch so quickly. And like you say, it is the truth of the fact that you didn't mean to go down that line, and all of a sudden you haven't been. So shall we go anymore? Because I haven't missed it. I don't really need to go. Oh, and that's when people tell, well, I am a strong enough Christian without it. So I love songs of praise, and they always bring somebody on some celebrity that's going to talk about Christianity, and they say, so how long have you been going to church? Well, I don't really go to church. So you're not a Christian in any way, shape, or form, are you? You've just got a book to sell, and here you are on Songs of Praise selling it. So, or a film to sell, and this, that, the other. Julian Fellows on the other day. And he goes, well, I really have respect for people who've got faith. Well, that was good. Why is he on Songs of Praise then? Surely you could have brought somebody in that believed in the Lord. And that's a different side of it altogether. We can easily get into that kind of case. And there we go. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. I hope that you have been blessed by that. I've really enjoyed sharing that with you. Not just the gimmick, but understanding both the pattern and understanding that even in these tiny, tiny little judges, there is a great lot to be pulled out from them. So next time you see 30 sons riding 30 donkeys, going off to 30 villages, you'll be thinking about McDonald's. Yeah.